Thank you, Dizzy Gillespie. Welcome to the show. I'm Don Manning. I'm here with Rosie the Jazz Dog and my exciting guest, most charming and attractive, Diane Mitchell. Diane, welcome to the show.
Hi, Don. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, it's my honor, believe me. Now, I'm going to mention a few things that might get lost in the shuffle if I don't do it right now, see? Now, Downbeat Magazine had an article in December of 49. I was in New York then, by Pat Harris. She did a lot of good interviews. Pat Harris, and this looks like it's on the front page. It says, from Chicago, listening to Keith Red Mitchell play bass is an amazing experience. His choice of notes, phrasing, and ideas is highly individual. His execution of them, flawless. Got that right. Pianist Ralph Burns, who with drummer Sonny Igo and Red make up the rhythm section of the Woody Herman Septet. And it says Woody believes that Mitchell is one of the most stimulating bassists he's ever played with. Well, I remember that it was when they went to Cuba. Wasn't that right?
Right. He went and met Woody in Cuba in 1949. He was there and roomed together with Milt Jackson. It was quite an experience for him. You know, at this age, when you're reading that, you have to remember he was 22 years old. And I think that's pretty common among the true inventors of the art form. It seems as though they were all known when they were 19, 20 years old, whatever. Clifford Brown, I mean, guess all of them seem to come up very early in life. It was clear that they were...
Yeah, there is a pattern there.
If you read the next line, Don, in that review, was the line that I enjoyed, and what I thought we would talk a lot about today was not only that he was an amazing bass player, but he was also an amazing thinker. And she wrote, but when you find out how the mind under that carrot topping is working, amazing is a mild word indeed.
Oh, man.
So that's what I was hoping today, that we could go through and play a little bit of Red's early recordings from the 50s, a couple of his own compositions, and then we could go further forward into his career where he felt the need to articulate, to verbalize his feelings, and he started writing songs, a lot in the genre of Dave Frischberg and Jay Leonard and others in the tradition, Blossom Dearie.
I'm learning a lot here, because I didn't know all this.
Well, he was quite an amazing man, and I feel very blessed. I met him first in 1976 on an airplane going to Stockholm. Red had moved to Stockholm in 1968. I had moved there in 1970 to go to college, and then I met a Swede and got married and had two wonderful boys, Eric and Martin. Red had gone there in 1968 because he wanted to just play jazz, and I think in America by the middle 60s it was pretty hard to get a gig where you could just play jazz. He was doing extremely well at that time.
Oh, yeah, he was in the studios too.
Exactly, he was in the studios. He was making a lot of money
he didn't like
at the time. He loved it during those great years. You know, he was Henry Mancini's first bassist
my gosh.
At MGM.
Wow.
And so for the general audience, not the musicians out there who know Red's music very well, but the general public, they've all heard his sound. He was the bass player on the Pink Panther theme.
Was he?
All of the TV recordings were Red in the studios.
Peter Gunn and stuff like that?
The Peter Gunn show as well. You know, Leroy Vinegar was also on those early recordings.
Well...
But in the studios, Red was on for the television programs, and it with Plas Johnson, the two of them. So everybody does know him. You know him from all the Mancini great themes like Breakfast at Tiffany's, Moon River, you know.
Boy.
All in all, he was on over 200 films, and that's one place I actually do get some royalties for those reissues and reuses.
Great.
Yeah,
That's great. But when you met him on the plane, you were with your husband,
Right.
And he was with someone.
he was with a woman he was living at the time, Katharina.
How did it happen that you talked?
Well, we were all up at the front of the plane because my youngest was 6 months old, and they put the children, you know, up at the front bulkhead seat, and he had his bass, and that also had to be placed at the bulkhead seat. And in fact, Red had 5 basses, but at that time he had just gone back to the U.S. for the first time in 7 years to play, and he had his bass with him on the plane. So we were all up together, and it was funny because Red was a redhead with a red beard, and so was my first husband. In fact, their color was almost the same, and it was somewhat of an irony, I guess, in my life, but my mother was a redhead too, so I don't know how that happened. But in any case, they were both wonderful people, and I'm still very good friends with my first husband. Any case, Red and I got together first in 1982. His girlfriend, who I'd met at that time, they had broken up, but she always liked me, and she didn't like another gal he had been dating. So he was gone for 3 months, and she was taking care of his mail. She put my change of address card on the top of all of his mail, and he called me that night, the first thing before he unpacked his bags, and insisted I meet him at 10:30 at the train station for dinner, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. And
oh my!
So I did that, and we had a ball. I just fell over laughing. He was a really funny guy, and he was probably, I think he was the nicest person I've ever known in my whole life.
That's beautiful.
So that was it. So why don't we play some music for him?
I love him.
Okay.
I love him.
He had gotten attracted to Europe because of his reception in Europe as well. He went there in 1954 with both Jerry Mulligan and Billie Holiday.
Oh, Billie Holiday.
Sure. And Red Norvo, of course.
Oh, my.
And I can read you what Jim Hall had to say about Red. He said, Red played the most gorgeous melodic solos of anybody on any instrument. I think maybe he and Lester Young were in the same league. The fact that it was coming out of a string bass was mind-boggling.
Isn't that great?
Wasn't that nice? That was great. We don't have time to include everybody today. I wish I could have brought more music.
I've got that covered by having a return visit soon.
That would be good.
Do you want to tell them about Sonny Speaks?
Yeah, well, there are 2 tracks on this one Woody Herman LP that's out there, and they're the only 2 that I know of recordings that are available where Red played with Woody. And I think, you know, especially for all the young musicians to understand and know that the Woody Herman Band was really important as the school. I mean, that's where you really learned. But unfortunately, Red couldn't take the road just physically. He, after a year with Woody on the road, he came down with tuberculosis, the same strain that killed Charlie Christian and Jimmy Blanton. But at the time, in 1951, they had come up with streptomycin, and after a year in the hospital, he survived it. But let's listen to Woody Herman.
Okay, let's do that. Sonny Speaks. Sonny Speaks. Sonny probably meaning Sonny Berman. Boy, that was terrific.
Yeah, he was quite a bass player.
We're talking about Red Mitchell. If you tuned in late, we have Diane Mitchell was married to him. Now, where do we go next here?
Well, I thought we're just trying to give the audience a few tunes from the 50s and that era so that they know that Red, at that time when he was tuning his bass in fourths, by the way, and we'll talk about his fifth tuning later, he was an important fixture on the West Coast. I mean, when I interviewed Paul Horn, for example, he said, Diane, when I got to L.A., and he wrote this in his book, he said his first gig with Chico Hamilton, he was behind stage, and Chico said to him, now look out there. There's Benny Carter, Leonard Feather, and Red Mitchell. Now you're in for the big time. And Paul said they had so much respect for Red that they called him Mr. Mitchell, even though he was only a couple of years older than him. He was a god to so many of these. And Red loved young musicians, and he was on the first recording of so many. He was on Paul Horn's first recording as a leader. He was often chosen to be on those recordings. He was very special. But getting back to the idea of Red as a composer and Red as a thinker, I thought this next one would be fun to play just because I love the title. It's called Jam for Your Bread.
Well, now you're talking about Hampton Hawes.
Yeah.
With Red Mitchell.
He was pretty important to Red.
What did he say about Hampton?
Well, he loved Hamp. I mean, probably, I don't know.
What a combination.
They worked together continuously from 55 to 57, and then later in the 60s for a period. And even in 1977, they had a trip planned to Japan, and Red had the bags packed, everything was ready to go, and he got the call that Hamp had died. So the tour was canceled, but...
talking about Hampton Hawes here.
Yeah. Anyway, let's hear him with Conti Candoli and Joe Maney.
What a lineup. Chuck Thompson, drums, Joe Maney, alto, and Conti on trumpet.
Yeah.
Gee.
What a loss to lose Conti recently.
Oh, terrible.
Yeah.
Did you know him?
He was a sweetheart. I brought him here to Oregon. A couple years ago, he played the Willamette University Big Band Festival, and the students just adored him, you know. There wasn't any better. In any case, this is called Jam for Your Bread.
What a classic group.
Yeah, that was great.
Joe Maney, Connie Candoli with Red Mitchell, Hampton Hawes, Chuck Thompson. He used to play with Bird. I knew Chuck Thompson on Central Avenue.
Wow.
Oh, boy.
Well, he had a lot of favorites, and the next selection that I chose was a dedication to his second wife, Rosie, who was a dancer. She worked the strip clubs where Lenny Bruce and a lot of the jazz musicians played in Los Angeles. During that time, of course, she stopped dancing after they got together, but it's called Rosie's Spirit.
Can we include Rosie the Jazz Dog in on that?
Sure.
Do you hear that, Rosie?
She'll like
Rosie's Spirit. Oh, she says it's an honor.
Sometime I'll play for another tune that Red wrote called The Purest Heart. He was an animal lover. And
he was.
In performances, he'd appeal to all the animal lovers in the audience by singing his tune called The Purest Heart.
Oh, my gosh. Have we got that today?
I don't know whether we'll have time for it. I don't know. I'll check and see.
It'll either be now or a return visit. I got to hear that.
Oh, yeah, you got to hear that one.
So we're going to...
Anyway, on this next one, it was a quintet that I think Red felt very good about. Harold Land is a rather shy person, but fabulous musician and quite a gentleman. I've had occasion to talk to Harold many times. We just lost him too, I guess.
Yes, we
year.
did.
Yeah. Anyway, they had a quintet together with...
It doesn't say on the
Carmel
back.
Jones. It's Carmel Jones on trumpet.
Okay. Red Mitchell featured on bass. Yes, besides Red Mitchell and Harold Land, we had Frank Strazzeri piano and Leon Petty's drums. Sure, a wonderful group, Diane.
Yeah, it was a great group. I mean, there are hundreds of recordings from the 1950s. Leonard Feathered said I think around the 1960s, thought Red had been on over 1,000 recordings at that time.
Oh, awesome.
I got to ask Leonard about that, and he said he did pick it out of a hat, but I'm actually wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't that many. You know, they'd go into the studios and make 3 records a day sometimes.
Wow.
With Hampton Hawes, the all-night sessions, you know, that was recorded overnight and turned out to be 3 records, you know.
Well,
one thing was that I should point out that Red was never in love with the term West Coast jazz.
he wasn't.
No, he felt that was something that the companies came up with as a kind of a gimmick because, and you can hear that Red wasn't the music from his heart, where it was his own group. It sounds more East Coast than West Coast.
Yeah. We're going to have Leroy Vinegar Day, May 1st, a week from today.
Oh, that's right.
That's proclaimed Leroy Vinegar Day. Did Red and he know each other?
They were great buddies. In fact, that tune, Rosie Spirit, Rosie was dating Leroy before she dated Red.
Oh.
And they were very close. Red talked to Leroy on the phone for 3 hours from Stockholm before we made our final decision to move to Oregon.
Oh, my gosh.
Of course, Leroy encouraged him to come here.
That should have been recorded, huh?
Yeah.
Some phone call.
Well, Red was like that. He called everybody, you know. Our phone bills were, I think, like about $500 a month, and we're talking 20 years ago. That was a lot of money for us, but staying in touch with his friends was more important to him than anything. You know, if he was given a music lesson at home, and they'd have a question about a tune, a Dizzy tune or something, he'd say, "Let's call Dizzy."
Oh my gosh!
And you can imagine the students loved it.
Oh my gosh!
And Dizzy would always respond.
Well,
and,
sure.
You know,
sure.
And I think he wanted young musicians to not be afraid to approach the masters, because that's how you learn.
You mean that's what Red thought?
Yeah, you should always.
Probably Dizzy too. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sure, sure. I saw Dizzy help people a lot.
Yeah.
Now, what about...
He was a character.
Yeah. I sure miss him.
You bet.
Miss them all.
Yeah.
You know, could you just take time out and answer about how his connection was with Chet Baker?
Well, surely he knew everybody played at Tiffany's and the Renaissance in Los Angeles. When I think Red was probably there the night that Chet came in and played for Mulligan. You know, the night when Mulligan was auditioning all the trumpet players. And after Chet played, that was it. He just told everybody else to go home. And
well, what did you think of him?
Everyone had told me that Chet was very quiet. In fact, a Swedish friend had been the road manager on a tour, and he said he drove him for 2 weeks, and he never said a word on the whole time. And so I didn't know what to expect, but the day we hung out with him,
sure,
he was as talkative as anybody I've ever known. And he was a sweetie, you know. He didn't read music. He just was totally intuitive. And on this, he and Red made a video that should be out there, should be available somewhere in Japan. I don't know. I have copies of it, but Red had worked out his own changes on My Romance, and they're sitting at the piano, and Red played the tune, and Chet just picked up the trumpet and played it back to him. It was very touching. It was very beautiful. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Red asked him the story about Chet meeting Mussolini's son, Romano Mussolini. So we got the story right, and in so many places I see it quoted wrong. You know?
Yeah, well, isn't that the way of the world?
Yeah, it was like Chet said to Romano when they first met, "Sure as a drag what they did to your dad."
Right.
And then Chet said, Red said, "Did you really say that?" And he said, "Yeah, well, like it wasn't cool." and then Red said, "You played a lot with Mussolini in Italy." And Chet said, real serious, "Yeah, he's got a big name in Italy."
Oh, gosh. For our younger listeners, you have to say that the father of the piano man that Diane's talking about was up there with Hitler in World War II. And they had executed him right after the war and forgive it, but hung him upside down. And that's where Chet Baker said,
"Sure is a drag what they did to your dad." But anyway, Chet was cute. He was a sweetie. We took him to dinner and we had a great time. And he told me he would never drive in Stockholm because they drove too slow.
Oh, my gosh.
He loved to drive fast cars.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
That sure is.
I was so lucky to meet so many of these great inventors of the art form.
How long were you two together and going around meeting people? Was it 10 years?
10 years. Mm. And those years were special because there was such a huge comeback.
Yeah.
Just at the beginning of the 80s, there were huge festivals that started all over the world, and everybody was looking for everybody in the closets who'd been forgotten, and they were all coming out.
Sure, like Shorty Rogers.
Oh, man, everybody. And there were some of these wonderful jazz parties.
Did you ever go to Dick Gibson's?
Actually, we never did go to Gibson's party.
How about Hugh Hefner?
No, but there was a jazz party for one in Holland by the guy who and his wife who owned the Jazz Inn record stores. And they put on a party 2 years we were there, and I'm telling you, everybody was there, from the Basie band to, I think the surprise guest one year was Benny Carter, the surprise guest the following year was Sarah Vaughan. Every great trombone player, trumpet player, guitarist. I have pictures, it was just Clark Terry, and I must say, I wish we had time to talk more about Clark. I think he and Red were two of those musicians who cared about the younger generation, who discovered so many young players, He was special, and they did a duo together for years and traveled around Europe doing
just
that.
Red and
Just
Clark?
Red and Clark, and they made 2 CDs.
Trumpet and bass.
That were a tribute to Duke and Basie.
Can't miss.
Anyway, but why don't we play some more music? I thought, actually, this would be a chance for us to sort of turn over and play some of Red.
Excuse me for interrupting you, but since I have to take a station break, then we'll start in on what you're about to say is that we're going into another facet of Red's talent.
Right, where he wrote songs.
One that I'm not that...
And sang them.
No, I'm not familiar with that. Now, you're listening to radio station KBOO Portland 90.7 on your FM dial. And in case you tuned in late, it's Don Manning has the luck to have Diane Mitchell here today, and the subject is her late husband, the great Red Mitchell. And anything she's got to say is fascinating to me, and I'm sure it will be to you. Now, let's think about this other department of his talent.
All right. Well, when he left the United States in 1968, he left for many reasons, mostly to be in a place where he could just play jazz. And also he had remembered Sweden from 1954 when he was there with Red Norvo and Billie Holiday. But he also left because of the violence that had come into the studio world. He felt that his music was being used for violent shoot-'em-ups. There was more and more of that kind of filmmaking that was going on.
I heard that.
And, of course, he was crushed by the assassinations of Martin Luther King. He was a devout follower of Martin Luther King. Bobby Kennedy, of course, Robert Kennedy. I think it was first when Robert Kennedy was killed that he became politicized. Before that, he just thought about music and thought about, all the players. But at that point in his life, his marriage was in turmoil and ending, and so he decided it was time to get out. And Dizzy took him on the road for 6 weeks, but there wasn't a lot of money in that. So, in any case, he took off and he went to Stockholm and he started writing songs. He wanted to get over the frustration of not being able to verbalize his feelings. And for Red, music says something. It's not there for entertainment. It's not there for, a repetitive beat that's, it's going to numb you in some way. He wanted melody, of course, and he wanted to say something to the world. And so from those years on, he wrote 122 songs on every subject, from politics to love and war and hate and nature. He was a great thinker. So the first one he did when he formed his Swedish quintet in Sweden, it was called Communication. They made a record. Now on this record he sings solo, but he wrote a tune called What I Am. When he got there, someone interviewed him for 5 hours, and then they turned the tape machine off and they said, "Now what are you?" So he said, "That sounds like a song." So that's what we're going to play for you now. It's called What I Am.
Strawberry nose and sugar cube teeth, pear-shaped body, and my real name's Keith. Bet my whole soul on the whole human race. Write songs sometimes and I play some bass. My face is my misfortune. My bass is pretty, fortunately for me. My ace in the hole is the hole in my ear. I hear Dizzy and Bird and Lester, Sarah and Lay. That's what I am, and that's what I do. Hope that helps you when you're feeling blue. Oh, I said what I meant what I said. My name's Keith, but you can call me Red. Ooh, I'm just like you, an animal too. Got my own bag just like a kangaroo. Sometimes a bear, sometimes an elf. I'm a motley crew all by myself. My face my aches in the hole is the hole in my ear. I hear Sonny and Train and Dexter Wayne and Miles Dean, Quinn and Shay Allen, Zoot, Bill Evans and Scotty, Chapo and Satch and Roy, Red Allen and C.T. and Earl, candy and cake, goodies and treats, face full of hickeys and I still love sweets. Single track mind, no good at lies, world's worst memory, so I improvise. Oh, I hear Ellington, Hampton, Horace, Carl Perkins, and Basie, Illinois, Ben, and Sweets, the Lizard, and Peggy, Oliver, Milt, Mahalia Jackson, and Chubby. Well, I could go on all night. I've learned from so many, and that's what I am. That's what I do. Hope that helps you with your interview. Oh, I said what I meant and meant what I said. My name's Keith, but you can call me Red. Oh,
Sounds like a classic to me.
Yeah. Well, you can hear what
Fantastic.
a great piano player he was.
Who?
Red. That was Red playing
That was
piano.
him playing the piano?
Sure.
I missed that in your description.
You know, he started out on piano.
my
Actually, he started
gosh.
out on alto.
Oh, my gosh. Now, that's a born musician.
Well, he started out on piano when he was 3, you know.
Well, jeez, didn't know it.
Yeah. And often when he would write a song, he would start at the piano and then go and play it on the bass. So he didn't take up the bass till he was 19. You'll get to hear a lot of his piano playing here. I've got a few examples here, too, of where he plays both piano and then overdubs the bass. So he's playing with himself.
Oh, my.
But in any case, he was a great
Gosh.
piano player.
Golly, that was great.
For Red, you know, swing was important, and you can always dance to whatever Red played, you know. He also wrote poetry. A couple years ago, I put out this little poetry book of Red's. Probably he would have written songs to all of them at some point, but one of the short little poems here I think represents who he was. Says, it's called Sound and Soul. It isn't really rigid metronomic time that counts. It's sound and soul, communication, love, support, and bounce. And I love that. That just sort of sums it up for who he was as a great musician. The next selection is with a guitar player, the great Herb Ellis. And that's one of my favorite records because it swings so hard. And he wrote a tune called Biggin' and the Bear, which he dedicated to Walter Page and Jimmy Blanton.
The two big daddies of the bass.
This was made at Concord Records, and the fun part about it was that Gary Larson agreed to do the cover for the album. It was an LP at first. It's called Doggin' Around. This is going to be Biggin' and the Bear.
Biggin' and the Bear. Biggin' bass lines there. Because we are heir to that there. Be good if you care. Be great if you dare. Behind Walter Page and Jack the Bear. Biggin' and the Bear. Biggin' bass lines there. Because we are heir to that there. Be good if you care. Be great if you dare. Be
Red Mitchell. I was lucky enough to meet all three of those bass players. Red Mitchell, Walter Page, and Jimmy Blanton.
What were they like?
Oh, Jimmy Blanton was just so kind to us kids. He was a kid himself, and he was just so kind to us. He was in a theater so kids could go. And he was just a beautiful cat. And so was Walter Page, one of my great loves also. So I go right with this. I surely do. Now, I could mention a real fast story that happened to me in the Hollywood Hills is I went with Red Kelly to play a session up at Herb Geller's house, and it had Herb Geller alto and his wife Lorraine on piano, and Red Mitchell and Red Kelly both. So while we jammed, they traded off on bass, and I got to play the drums.
Wow.
And so after this was over, this has got a big punchline too. After this was over, somebody, probably Herb Geller, said, let's all go to the such and such place, one of those fancy Hollywood places where you get milkshakes and sandwiches and something. And we went there, but another guy had joined us in the meantime, very good-looking guy, and I didn't know at all who it was. When we got there, everybody's all full of a sense of humor. Every one of them, Red Kelly, Red Mitchell, they're all telling jokes, and this newcomer, to me, is also talking very strangely and wildly, Lenny Bruce.
Oh, man.
And I had no idea in the world who he was.
Really? Oh, wow. I know they were good friends.
What did Mitchell say about Lenny?
He loved him, of course. He loved him. The next one, he did a solo record in New York. It's called Simple Isn't Easy. And it's one of those expressions that I say to myself every day, you know, in your job, whatever you're doing. Something that should be easy turns out to be really complicated, you know, and you just say to somebody, wow, simple isn't easy. And Red said he got that expression from Dizzy, who said, you know, he was talking about drummers and trying to just, you know, get it right at the center of the beat. Simple isn't easy, you know.
Oh, gosh.
So Red wrote a tune about it, and I think it says a lot about him as a person as well in the lyrics. So
can we get his records?
Well, a lot of them I still have. I had a mail order catalog when he died. I put it together, and it's actually still on the web. You can just do a search for Mitchell Music Management, or just do a search for Red Mitchell, and usually it comes up first, Red Mitchell, Mitchell Music Management. And I have a little company called Red Ink Jazz Shop, and there's a list there of all the CDs that I have available, and I'm thrilled and delighted if anybody would like to call and order them, or you can just call me at 503-241-4911.
Well, that's great, Diane.
And you can pretty much search the web. There are other websites where you can find a lot of these things too. Cadence Records has a lot in their catalog.
What about when I go into a record store? Are they treating him okay? Has he got a bin? Or?
Of course not. You know, when you get in there may be 2 or 3, and they're just, the distribution is the problem. You know, it always has been. And the smaller companies have a hard time getting him into the stores. You know, today in this world, they make, you know, whatever is it, 36,000 records a year are released, new releases. So the stores don't have the room, the stock to keep things in. So I'm grateful to the internet that allows us to find a lot of these things that might get lost otherwise.
Great, Diane.
Yeah. So why don't we play Simple Isn't Easy?
Great idea.
Simple isn't easy, it's the hardest thing. If you're simple, people think you're lazy. Truthfulness is just a mess unless you swing. If you're truthful, people think you're crazy. There are things there can't be too much of. Simple things like honesty and love. Love to see the day when we can say we're free. Freedom isn't free, it costs much more than luxury. It's plain to see why simple isn't easy. You see what I mean? Simple isn't easy, it's the hardest thing. If you're simple, people think you're lazy. Truthfulness is just a mess unless you swing. If you're truthful, people think you're crazy. There are things there can't be too much of. Simple things like honesty and love. Love to see the day when we can say we're free. Freedom isn't free, it costs much more than luxury. It's plain to see why simple isn't easy. Woo, see what I mean?
That's nothing short of phenomenal.
Yeah. He was a genius with words.
Yes, Red Mitchell.
I wanted to take a couple of tunes off of another CD that we have here called Home Sweet. Actually, there's 2 CDs that he got Grammys for during the time that we were together, and this first one is called Home Sweet. It has a 20-minute bass solo. We're not going to play that for you today, but then it has also a few tunes that he wrote, and one of them is called Rainy Night, and this was a good example of a tune that he wrote in the 50s, but at a time when he couldn't verbalize his feelings. And once he'd acquired the skill to do that, suddenly he got lyrics to all of these tunes that he had written when he was so young. The first one I wanted you to play was called Rainy Night, which I think was written in 1953. That song came out of a conversation with my sons, Eric and Martin. They were 7 and 9 at the time, and we were out on the balcony, and it was getting really windy, and he was explaining to Martin the physics of watching the leaves turn on the aspen trees. And it was just a very, very wonderful evening with the boys. And he went home, and then he called me, and he said he wrote this lyric that was to all of us, really, but especially to the boys.
It starts to rain, but softly. The air is rising, the leaves upturned, the drops surprising, and it's a rainy night. The rain is cool but friendly, and I embrace you, and you're upturned. I love to face you. I love a rainy night. starts to rain, but softly. The air is rising, the leaves upturned, the drops surprising, and it's a rainy night. The rain is cool but friendly, and I embrace you, and you're upturned. I love to face you. I love a rainy night. Am I right?
Now, I predict that there'll be a real resurgence of interest in Red Mitchell. I do.
Well,
He's got so much to offer, and people don't know.
he was a person who really touched your soul. I mean, he was so friendly with people that even if they only met him for 10 minutes, they thought he was their friend. And
Yeah, how did he do that?
it was so wonderful when this particular record came out. It was the Swedish Concert Bureau, the Swedish state record company, Caprice, that put it out. And then the State Concert Bureau arranged for us to go to 44 different communities. And it was such a wonderful time. We went on 2 different occasions, traveling all over the country. And the State Concert Bureau hired me as the road manager to do the driving and helping Red set up the bass and being his sound person, of course. And it was so, I'll never forget all the small little libraries out in the country, where he'd put on a concert, and just playing bass and the piano and singing and talking was more powerful. He felt in some ways the response he got from the people was more powerful than many of the great recordings he did with larger groups,
That's fascinating.
It was an opportunity for him to talk to people directly and communicate.
Well, this man, Red Mitchell, is a legend.
Yeah, he was. But he was a normal,
He is.
regular guy,
Was he good at remembering people's names?
Not real
You
good,
must
and
have
that's
met
one of the
so
reasons
many
he liked
people.
having me around, because I would have to
Is
whisper
that
in his ear
right?
to
Yeah.
remember names. It was okay.
He met so many people.
Right. And I think he shared all of this with me and wanted me so often with him, and he wanted me to meet everyone in the music business. And I think, it wasn't that he had to have a woman by his side in that regard. He was a very strong personality. He certainly, But I think because he had done so much in his lifetime, he knew that somebody later on was going to have to carry on this work and get a lot of work reissued or issued for the first time, document his history and keep things together. And by knowing all the people, it's easier for me to do that. So I hope one day there will be a book. I have to work. I'm working as a realtor now, and I do enjoy that too. But
A book, that's a great idea.
this brings me back to the desire to want to get that done, because he did have a lot to say. You want to play one more tune off of that one?
Sure.
It's called The Genius to Compose.
To compose, which comes from Latin, only means to place together. It can be some silk and satin, or it could be wood and leather. And a genius is a very special guiding light or spirit. I'm convinced that almost everyone has got some and can hear it. Harmony. I love harmony, and I love a rhyme and a melody. These are some of nature's gifts, as surely as can say almost anything. How old is the music of the universe? Who knows? When a child plays with building blocks and comes up with something new, or when we make love one on one, that's composing too. Feelings run to romance and fun, but the lust for life is the deepest one. Lust and love are parents of the genius to compose. How about a little Duke? When a child plays with building blocks and comes up with something new, or when we make love one on one, that's composing too. Feelings run to romance and fun, but the lust for life is the deepest one. Lust and love are parents of the genius to compose. I suppose, who knows, that's how it goes.
Boy, oh boy. That's something, huh?
Yeah.
Wow.
I was just sitting here looking at it. I brought this Medal of Honor
Oh,
in to show you, Don. Just
absolutely. Wild.
for fun. You know, Red had lived in Sweden for 24 years, and we left in 1992, a lot because Red had been coming to the U.S. to play more. My parents were ill, and they loved Red dearly, so my father offered to buy us a little house, which was nice. We loved Oregon, thanks to Jim and Mary Brown at the time, who had invited us to come to the Ottercrest parties that were fabulous. We fell in love with Oregon, but when it was announced in Stockholm that we were leaving, I think the country kind of went into shock, and they didn't know what to do. I mean, he'd become such a fixture in this celebrity life of Sweden, and they were so indebted to him for all he'd given. So he was in the middle of a recording at the radio, and the phone rang, and they insisted that Red go and answer the telephone. And it was the Minister of Culture who told him that the Swedish government had just unanimously voted him a Medal of Honor, which was the equivalent of the Freedom Medal, I would say, for, that makes me cry, for all he had given to Sweden. And it's very special to have. It's called
it's beautiful.
Illis Quorum in the 8th degree, and it says on it in Latin, for one who deserves it.
Oh, my.
And so that was special.
Red Mitchell.
So I think the last one, maybe we might not have time for much more, but...
Yeah, we're cool.
Okay.
Can I tell you a touching story about him?
Yeah.
He came to where my wife and I lived in Portland, and she had a restaurant. It was the Anchorage, and he had the woman with him that he was seeing at that time. I would say this is
Katharina,
70s.
probably.
70s. And we not only talked at the house, but we went down and tied one on with food. We had some fine dinners. And when this was over and he had departed, we all of a sudden got a phone call from him that he had lost his wallet.
Oh.
And in it was his passport and all other important papers. And he was just fit to be tied. So we went around the room feeling all the chairs and looking in the car and this and that and the other, and said, well, now, we can't find it right now, but what you should do is call us back after we've had more time to look. And so he was going to do that. So then we looked further, and we actually found it at the bottom of one of the couches. It had gone way down in there. When he called, I said, we've got good news, and he cried.
Yeah, I can imagine. Pretty stressful. He had a hard time. That was one reason that maybe as many people didn't know about him, but being on the road for him was very stressful. He...
In what way?
Well, he was always worried something was going to happen to the bass. You have to schlep the bass. You got to carry the amps. They were heavy. He had put his back out in the early 50s, so I was with him. You know, you have to do all of that stuff. And then you're on the road, you're on a bus, you get 2 or 3 hours of sleep, and you're supposed to get up on stage and play your best. And he much preferred being home playing in his living room. Where he could be completely relaxed. He just wasn't built for it. Some people are. Some people thrived on it. Woody Herman thrived on
Dizzy thrived on it.
Dizzy thrived on it. But most of them, I got to listen to all the complaints.
Well, it's a rough go.
It's a very rough go. You don't get the right nutrition.
That's right.
You eat too much. You drink too much. You know,
That's right.
Everybody wants to entertain you. And
well, that's good, because I wanted to hear it in your own words, and that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, this next one is called A Declaration of Interdependence. We could do a whole nother show on Red's views on politics and whatnot, but we don't have time today for that. There were so many facets to his personality. But I think as all of the great, I've just listened to interviews, not met all these people necessarily, but Arthur Rubinstein, others I've seen interview, people, they care about the world. Beyond the music they play or whatever they did, they were generally optimists and had a good sense that the world should survive. And somehow they were a vessel that was allowing an expression that would help make that survival possible.
Sure.
You know, I don't know how to put it in the right words.
No,
but
that's right.
Something like that.
That is true. That is true.
I loved his songs.
Ways,
I loved his songs.
well,
and that was one of the reasons he loved me.
ways, the credit really even doesn't go all to you, because you're born how you're born.
That's right.
And if it works out real great, that's real great.
Wow.
Okay, we're going to hear this one now.
Black and white, red and green, yellow, beige, in between. Now is the time for love and a declaration of interdependence. North and south, east and west, rich and poor, worst and best. Now is the time for love and a declaration of interdependence here and now. When you start a new nation, you've got to declare your intention to be independent. But it's time to begin a new world where we're all aware of how totally we are mutually dependent. Women, men, young and old, straight and gay, shy and bold. Now is the time for love and a declaration of interdependence here and now. Amen.
I want to thank Diane Mitchell. She has presented a most wonderful potpourri of Red Mitchell's accomplishments, and I'm sure we only scratched the surface, Diane.
You bet.
So you promised to pretty pleased to come back soon?
Sure, that would be fun.
She's handed me the Gene Lee's book called Cats of Any Color. You can get it at Powell's. And in there is a chapter on Red.
Yeah, it's called The Return of Red Mitchell.
The Return of Red Mitchell. Thank you so much, Diane Mitchell. I had a wonderful time. This is Don Manning and Rosie the Jazz Dog signing off. Flat 5. Red Mitchell, go. Blow.
Classics, jazz, rock and roll, avant-garde, gospel soul. Now is the time for love and a declaration of interdependence. Science tries, science fails, theater cries, music wails. Now is the time for love and a declaration of interdependence here and now. Well, okay, we've been given the urge to defend number one, our own selves and our own. But our own doesn't mean just some folks like ourselves, but all forms of life. You know, life isn't something we own, it's on loan. You and me, them and us, we're all we. What's the fuss? Now is the time for love and a declaration of interdependence.